Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a teenage girl looks down and sees blood. No warning, no explanation, no one to call. She has no idea what's happening to her body. Here's the thing, this happened to literally every woman who ever lived. Every single one, across every culture, every continent, every century. It's arguably the most universal experience in human history, and somehow it's one of the least talked about. Barely a footnote in most history books, buried under wars and kings and inventions that get whole chapters to themselves. So let's actually talk about it. First, a quick biology detour, because it explains everything that follows. Puberty isn't just growing up. From an evolutionary standpoint, your body is running a constant silent calculation. Do I have enough resources to support a pregnancy right now? Researcher Frisch proposed this back in the 1970s. A girl's body needs a minimum threshold of body fat, roughly 17%, before menstruation can even begin. Later research refined those exact numbers and debated them heavily, but the core idea held up over decades of scrutiny. Puberty isn't just about age, it's about energy. Your body checks its own fuel gauge before deciding reproduction is worth the risk. No spare fuel, no green light. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere inside a body with no calendar, no calculator, no awareness of any of this happening, a biological system is quietly running the numbers every single day. It's one of the strangest, most invisible forms of intelligence the human body has, which raises an interesting question. If it's really about energy, when did puberty actually happen for a prehistoric teenager? Later than you'd probably guess. Significantly later. In modern, well-fed, low-activity populations, the average age of a first period is around 12 or 13. But anthropologist Nancy Howell spent years studying the Kalahari's Gung, a hunter-gatherer society still living a traditional lifestyle well into the 20th century. She found menarche happening closer to 16 years old. Harder physical activity, leaner diets, more energy spent simply surviving day to day. All of it pushed that threshold back by years, and Howell's data isn't an isolated case. Similar patterns turn up in other subsistence societies. Anthropologists have studied the HA of Paraguay, groups in highland New Guinea, various populations living far from processed food and modern medicine, different continents, different diet, same basic pattern. It's a reasonable, evidence-based assumption that prehistoric girls followed something similar later, not earlier than what feels normal today.
Single shift reshapes how we should picture prehistoric adolescence. A girl in a hunter-gatherer band wasn't spending her early teenage years the way a modern teenager might. She was already a working, contributing member of group for years before her body reached this threshold. Gathering, carrying, learning, surviving. Puberty arrived once the body decided she could actually afford it. Now picture that 16-year-old deep in prehistory experiencing this for the first time. No mother sitting her down beforehand necessarily. No older sister who explained it last year. Depending on the group, depending on the century, she might be walking into this almost completely blind. Here's where we have to be honest. We do not know what she thought. Nobody wrote it down. There's no journal, no cave painting captioned "Day 1, extremely confused." Anyone claiming to know her exact emotional reaction, fear, shame, pride, confusion, is simply guessing, dressing up speculation as history. What we can do is look sideways at traditional societies, much closer to our own time, but still living outside industrial culture. Anthropologists have recorded how menarche gets handled across dozens of unrelated cultures on different continents, and a pattern emerges that's hard to ignore. First menstruation isn't hidden, it's marked. Among Native American groups, it triggered specific ceremonies, sometimes lasting days. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, seclusion rituals gave girls dedicated time away from daily labor. In parts of the Pacific, it involved celebration, touching the whole community, not just the girl's immediate family. Even in parts of South Asia, historic first menstruation was marked with specific rites, gifts, and gatherings before modern taboos push the topic back into silence. The specifics vary wildly, but the underlying instinct doesn't. Sometimes seclusion, sometimes ceremony, sometimes outright celebration, but almost always recognized as significant, not a secret, not something shameful to whisper about. Did prehistoric humans handle it the same way? We can't say for certain. That's thousands of generations we simply can't interview. But the pattern does suggest something worth sitting with. Treating periods as an unspeakable secret, something to hide even from close family, might be a distinctly modern habit, not a universal human one. Here's the frustrating part for archaeologists, though. Figuring out how prehistoric women actually managed this practically is incredibly hard for a very unglamorous reason. Whatever they use, plant material, soft hides, moss, anything absorbent, was organic, and organic material rots. It doesn't fossilize. It doesn't survive thousands of years buried in soil. It doesn't show up neatly labeled in a dig site next to a spearhead or a heart. So if you've ever heard someone confidently claim exactly what cave women use, full stop, no hesitation, that's not coming from a preserved artifact. There isn't one. There has never been one. What we actually have are hypotheses, reasonable, evidence-informed guesses built from materials we know were available and commonly handled at the time. Moss, soft plant fiber, prepared animal hide. These materials were already woven into daily life. life, used for wound care, for warmth, for general use around camp. So it's a logical inference they'd be used. Repurposed here too. Logical doesn't mean proven, though. Any honest historian will tell you plainly the direct physical evidence simply hasn't survived and probably never will. It's worth pausing on that gap for a second, because it says something bigger about how history gets written. We have detailed knowledge about prehistoric spear points, cooking fire, burial sites, cave art, things made of stone and bone and pigment, things that survive, but something that happened to roughly half the population every single month for their entire species' existence left almost no physical trace. Not because it wasn't important, just because of what it was made of. Once we hit written history, though, the picture gets dramatically clearer, because now, finally, people were writing things down. The oldest known women's health document is the Kahun gynecological papyrus from ancient Egypt, dating back to around 1800 BCE. It directly addresses menstrual issues alongside pregnancy and contraception, treated with the same seriousness as any other medical concern. A few centuries later came the Ebers papyrus, around 1550 BCE, referencing irregular versus regular bleeding as a marker physicians were expected to actively track in their patient. Egyptian medicine treated menstruation as legitimate medical territory, worth an entire scroll, worth a physician's careful attention 3,500 years ago. The Greeks and Romans took it further still. A physician named Soranus of Ephesus, writing around the 1st or 2nd century CE, produced a detailed 4-volume text simply titled Gynecology. It covered menstruation, anatomy, contraception, and childbirth in careful, methodical, almost clinical detail. He even recommended rest during particularly difficult periods, advice that honestly still sounds familiar 2,000 years later. Meanwhile, other ancient writers were far less scientific about it. Pliny the Elder, in the same era, wrote that menstrual blood could sour wine and dull mirrors, superstition dressed up as fact, spreading right alongside the real medicine, and in some way foreshadowing centuries of myth still to come. That mix, real medicine sitting right next to superstition, didn't go away. It followed menstruation through the Middle Ages, where some texts treated it as dangerous or unclean, and folk belief multiplied across Europe and beyond, many of them echoing Pliny almost word for word over 1,000 years later. So we have real medical texts, real historical detail, stretching back millennia, written by serious physicians taking the subject serious, but actual physical menstrual product from antiquity still almost non-existent in the archaeological record. Same reason as before. Cloth and plant fiber simply don't survive. Historical writers occasionally mention absorbent materials in passing, but modern historians stay cautious about how much weight to put on those mentions, since the primary evidence is thin at best. Trace most viral ancient period product facts back to their actual source, and that source usually turns out to be shaky, a single vague reference stretched into a confident headline.
Which brings us to a genuinely wild final fact. The convenient products most people use today, the ones nobody thinks twice about, are shockingly recent inventions. The first commercially sold pad was called Lister's Towels. It launched around 1996, and it flopped almost immediately. Victorian-era society considered it too shameful to even advertise, let alone discuss openly in stores. Women reportedly had to ask for it using a coded phrase just to avoid saying the word out loud at the counter. It took nurses in World War I noticing almost by accident that leftover wound dressing material absorbed blood far better than cloth to accidentally kickstart the entire modern sanitary pad industry. The tampon with a modern applicator wasn't even patented until 1931 by Dr. Earl Hart. It didn't reach store shelves under the name Tampac until the mid-1930s, and even then, it took decades more, well into the second half of the 20th century, for these products to become something openly advertised on television without euphemism. Let that sink in for a second. Humans have been menstruating for the entire existence of our species, hundreds of thousands of years, across every migration, every ice age, every civilization that ever rose and fell, and the products treated today as completely unremarkable, sitting quietly on every store shelf, are barely a century old. Measured against the full timeline of our species, that's not even a rounding error. For nearly all of human history, women simply figured it out themselves, generation after generation, passing down whatever practical knowledge they could, using whatever was actually available around them, with essentially no instructions, no products, and for long stretches of that history, almost total silence about the whole thing, which, honestly, makes it one of the most quietly impressive threads running through the entire story of being human, solved silently half the species over and over for as long as we've existed, with almost nothing to show for it in the archaeological record except the fact that we're all still here.